On March 15, 1888, lighthouse keeper Samuel Garrison recorded the passage of a large merchant vessel called the Pacific Star in his daily log at the Cape Perpetua Lighthouse on the Oregon coast. Garrison noted the ship's appearance at 2:47 p.m., described it as a three-masted schooner flying American colors, estimated its course as southbound toward San Francisco, and recorded weather conditions as clear with moderate seas. This was routine work for a lighthouse keeper, documenting ships that passed within view, maintaining records that could be useful for maritime authorities tracking vessel movements, and investigating incidents if ships went missing or were involved in accidents. But 3 days later, on March 18, the Pacific Star sank in a storm off the California coast with all hands lost. And here's what made this impossible. There was no ship called the Pacific Star. No vessel by that name was registered with any maritime authority. No shipping company claimed to operate such a ship. The Pacific Star that Samuel Garrison had recorded in perfect detail, that he had watched sail past his lighthouse in clear weather, had never existed. Over the following 2 years, from March 1888 through March 1890, Samuel Garrison would record the passage of 83 ships in his lighthouse log, and all 83 ships would sink exactly 3 days after Garrison recorded them, dying in storms or accidents or mysterious disappearances, with all crew lost. And all 83 ships would turn out to have never existed. No registration records, no insurance policies, no shipping companies that acknowledged owning them, no port authorities that had records of them departing or arriving anywhere. Garrison was recording phantom ships with perfect accuracy and detail, documenting vessels that sailed past his lighthouse, but that had no existence in any official record, and every single one of these impossible ships would sink 3 days later in real disasters that killed real sailors, even though the ships themselves apparently didn't exist. The phenomenon destroyed Samuel Garrison's sanity and his life. By early 1890, Garrison was convinced he could see the future, that the phantom ships he recorded were visions of vessels destined to sink, that he had somehow been cursed or blessed with prophetic knowledge that allowed him to document ships before they existed and to know their fates 3 days in advance. He filled his lighthouse logbooks with increasingly frantic notes about trying to warn maritime authorities about ships he saw passing that he knew would sink, about his inability to save phantom sailors from phantom disasters, about his growing terror that he was somehow causing the sinkings by recording the ships in his log. On March 22, 1890, Samuel Garrison threw himself from the top of the Cape Perpetua Lighthouse, dying on the rocks below, leaving behind 2 years of logbooks documenting 83 impossible ships that had all sunk exactly 3 days after he recorded them. Before we continue with the impossible story of Samuel Garrison and the 83 phantom ships he recorded, all of which sank exactly 3 days later, despite never having existed, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. Because what happened at Cape Perpetua Lighthouse between 1888 and 1890 challenges everything we understand about time, causation, and whether prophetic knowledge of future disasters can exist, and if so, what it does to those who possess it. The Cape Perpetua Lighthouse was built in 1873 on a rocky promontory jutting into the Pacific Ocean on the central Oregon coast, approximately 15 miles south of the small town of Yachits. The lighthouse stood 150 feet above sea level on sheer cliffs, with its light visible for approximately 20 miles on clear nights, serving as a critical navigation aid for ships traveling along the dangerous Oregon coast, where rocky outcroppings, unpredictable weather, and powerful currents made navigation treacherous, even for experienced captains. The lighthouse was staffed by a single keeper who lived in a small attached cottage, responsible for maintaining the light mechanism, keeping watch for ships in distress, and recording all vessel traffic that passed within view. Samuel Garrison had been appointed lighthouse keeper at Cape Perpetua in 1884, at age 42. After serving 12 years as assistant keeper at other lighthouses along the California and Oregon coasts, Garrison was known as reliable and meticulous, exactly the qualities desired in lighthouse keepers, who worked in isolation with limited supervision, and whose diligence could mean the difference between safety and disaster for ships depending on coastal lights for navigation. Garrison maintained detailed logs documenting weather conditions, ship passages, maintenance activities, and any unusual observations, sending monthly reports to the United States Lighthouse Board that oversaw all federal lighthouses. Garrison's logs from 1884 through early 1888 were exemplary, detailed, accurate, useful for maritime authorities tracking ship movements and investigating incidents. Garrison recorded approximately 300 to 400 ship passages per year, noting each vessel's appearance time, description, estimated course, and any identifying features like flags or distinctive hull markings. His observations were generally consistent with other records. Ships Garrison logged passing Cape Perpetua would typically appear in port records at their destinations within reasonable timeframes, confirming that Garrison was accurately documenting real vessels on real voyages. But beginning in March 1888, Garrison's logs began including entries for ships that could not be verified in any other records. The first was the Pacific Star entry on March 15. When the Lighthouse Board received Garrison's March report, including the Pacific Star observation, they routinely checked maritime registries to verify the vessel, but found no ship by that name. They assumed Garrison had misread the ship's name or had recorded it incorrectly, that the vessel was registered under a different name, and that the discrepancy was just clerical error. But then reports came that a ship matching Garrison's description had sank on March 18, exactly 3 days after his sighting, with all hands lost. And when investigators tried to identify the sunken vessel, they could find no ship that matched. No vessel was reported missing that could have been the ship that sank. No insurance claims were filed. No families reported sailors who failed to return from voyages. Over the following months, Garrison continued recording phantom ships. In April 1888, he logged 4 vessels that subsequently sank 3 days after his sightings, but that had no existence in maritime records. In May, 3 more phantom ships. By the end of 1888, Garrison had recorded 27 ships that had all sunk 3 days later, despite having no apparent existence before or during their supposed voyages. The Lighthouse Board began investigating seriously, sending inspectors to interview Garrison, to review his logs, and to determine whether he was fabricating entries or experiencing some kind of perceptual problem that made him record ships that weren't actually there. The inspectors found Garrison lucid and consistent, insistent that he was recording ships he actually observed passing the lighthouse, that these were not hallucinations or fabrications, but were real vessels that he watched sail by and documented according to his duties. Garrison showed inspectors his observation techniques, demonstrating how he used a telescope to examine passing ships in detail, how he noted distinctive features, how he estimated courses and speeds. The inspectors could find no evidence that Garrison was incompetent or delusional. But they also could not explain how he was recording ships that apparently didn't exist and that subsequently sank in real maritime disasters that killed real sailors. The pattern became undeniable through every ship Garrison recorded in his log would sink exactly 3 days later, and every ship he recorded had no existence in any maritime registry, no ownership records, no documentation of departure or arrival at any port. But the sinkings were real. Wreckage would be found, bodies would wash ashore, survivors in a few cases would report that their ship had sunk. But when these survivors described their vessels, and when they identified what ship they had been sailing on, the names and descriptions would never quite match what Garrison had recorded, and no official records would exist for the ships they claimed to have been aboard. One of the most disturbing cases occurred in July 1889, when Garrison recorded a ship called the Northern Light, describing it as a large passenger steamer with distinctive red smokestacks. 3 days later, a passenger steamer sank off the Washington coast in a storm, with over 40 lives lost. Survivors described a ship with red smokestacks, but they identified it as the Columbia, a vessel that was registered and that had departed Seattle on a scheduled run to San Francisco. But when investigators examined the registry for the Columbia, they found it had been sold and decommissioned 3 months earlier, that the ship survivors claimed to have been on had not existed as an active vessel at the time of the sinking. Yet the sinking was real, the bodies were real, the survivors' trauma was real. Somehow a ship that shouldn't have existed had sailed and had sank, and Garrison had recorded it 3 days before its destruction with perfect accuracy. The Lighthouse Board considered removing Garrison from his position, concerned that his apparent psychological deterioration might affect his ability to maintain the light and perform his critical duties. But Garrison's maintenance of the lighthouse itself remained impeccable. The light was always operational, the mechanisms were well maintained, and Garrison continued performing all his duties competently except for this one impossible anomaly of recording phantom ships that sank 3 days later. Board members debated whether Garrison's phantom ship entries represented some kind of elaborate hoax, but they could identify no motive. Garrison gained nothing from these entries. They created problems for him rather than benefits, and he seemed genuinely distressed by the phenomenon rather than amused by perpetrating a deception. By late 1889, Garrison's logbook entries had become increasingly frantic and disturbed. Alongside his technical documentation of phantom ships, he began adding personal notes expressing his anguish about what he was experiencing. "Saw another ship this day that I know will sink. I tried to signal them, but they could not see or would not respond. 3 days hence they will be dead, and I will have recorded their deaths before they occurred. Why am I cursed to see these doomed vessels? What purpose does this knowledge serve if I cannot save them?" These personal notes, interspersed with the technical ship observations, documented Garrison's deteriorating mental state as he struggled to understand and cope with his apparent precognitive visions. Garrison attempted various interventions to prevent the sinkings he felt he was predicting. He sent telegrams to Coast Guard stations, warning of ships he had observed that he believed would sink in 3 days, providing ship names and descriptions, and urging authorities to intercept the vessels and warn them of danger. But these warnings were useless, because the ships Garrison described couldn't be found. No vessels matching his descriptions were known to maritime authorities. No captains could be contacted to warn. No interventions could be made to prevent disasters involving ships that apparently didn't exist until they sank. The psychological burden of recording disasters before they occurred, of watching ships sail past knowing their crews would be dead in 3 days, of being unable to warn or save anyone despite having what seemed like prophetic knowledge, destroyed Garrison's ability to function normally. He stopped sleeping regularly, spending nights pacing the lighthouse gallery with his telescope, watching for more phantom ships and dreading their appearance. He lost weight, neglected his personal hygiene, and filled his logbooks with increasingly incoherent notes about destiny, about fate, about whether he was causing the sinkings by recording them or whether he was merely witnessing predetermined events that would occur regardless of his knowledge. In January 1890, Garrison wrote to the Lighthouse Board requesting to be relieved of his duties, stating that he could no longer bear the psychological burden of his position. "I see death approaching, and I can do nothing. Every ship I record is doomed. I am a prophet of disaster, a chronicler of deaths not yet occurred, and this knowledge is unbearable. I request that I be released from this duty before I lose my mind entirely or before this curse passes to whoever replaces me." But the Lighthouse Board denied his request, partly because they had no immediate replacement available, and partly because they believed Garrison's problems were psychological rather than supernatural, and that leaving his post might actually worsen his mental condition by removing him from structured routine and duties. The final phantom ship Garrison recorded was logged on March 19, 1890. A vessel called the Destiny's End, which Garrison described as a clipper ship, sailing north toward Portland in clear weather with all sails set. Garrison's entry for this ship included a long personal note. "This is the last one. I will not record another death. This ship will sink on March 22, and I will die the same day. I cannot prevent their deaths, but I can prevent myself from witnessing more. If someone reads this log after I am gone, know that I did not fabricate these entries. The ships were real to me, even if they were real to no one else. The deaths were real, and my inability to save anyone was the most real thing of all." 3 days later, on March 26, 1890, a clipper ship did sink off the Oregon coast in an unexpected storm. No ship called Destiny's End was registered or known to authorities, but wreckage matching Garrison's description washed ashore, and 2 bodies were recovered, wearing clothing consistent with late 19th century maritime workers. And on the same day, Samuel Garrison climbed to the top of the Cape Perpetua lighthouse and jumped to his death on the rocks 150 feet below, leaving behind 2 years of logbooks documenting 83 phantom ships that had all sunk exactly 3 days after he recorded them. The investigation into Garrison's death and into the phantom ship phenomenon was conducted by both the Lighthouse Board and by maritime safety authorities, who wanted to understand whether real ships had been involved or whether Garrison's records represented something else entirely. Investigators reviewed Garrison's complete logs from 1884 through March 1890, comparing his entries to maritime registries, port records, ship movements documented by other lighthouses and coastal stations, and to records of maritime disasters and disappearances during the relevant period. The findings were deeply disturbing. Garrison's entries from 1884 through February 1888 matched reality perfectly. Every ship he recorded could be verified in other records. His observations were accurate and useful, and there was no indication of fabrication or delusion. But beginning in March 1888, his entries diverged from verifiable reality. The 83 ships he recorded from March 1888 through March 1890 could not be verified in any maritime records. No ships by those names were registered. No shipping companies acknowledged operating vessels matching Garrison's descriptions. No ports had records of ships matching his observations, departing or arriving during the time frames when Garrison claimed to have seen them passing Cape Perpetua. But maritime disaster records from the same period showed 83 shipwrecks occurring 3 days after Garrison's corresponding logbook entries. The disasters were real. Wreckage was found. Bodies were recovered. Survivors in some cases provided testimony about ships sinking. But the ships involved in these disasters could not be definitively identified. Survivors would name their vessels, but those names wouldn't match registered ships. Wreckage would be consistent with ships of certain types and periods, but wouldn't have identifying marks that would allow confirmation of specific vessels. Bodies recovered would be real human remains, but wouldn't be identifiable as crew from any known missing vessel. The statistical probability of 83 coincidences, 83 times that Garrison recorded a phantom ship, and 3 days later a real maritime disaster occurred that killed real people, but involved a ship that couldn't be identified, was astronomically low. Some investigators concluded that Garrison must have been somehow involved in causing the disasters, that he had advanced knowledge of planned sabotage, or had been coordinating with pirates or wreckers. But this theory required assuming Garrison was a mass murderer who killed hundreds of sailors over 2 years for no apparent gain and then committed suicide, which made no sense given everything known about his character and behavior. Other investigators concluded that Garrison had experienced some kind of extended psychotic break that caused him to fabricate logbook entries that coincidentally preceded real maritime disasters, and that the apparent 3-day pattern was either coincidence or was the result of Garrison having access to information about ship movements that allowed him to predict which vessels might be at risk. But this theory struggled to explain how Garrison's fabricated ship descriptions would match real disasters so consistently, how he would have information about maritime movements that even authorities didn't have, and why his precognitive knowledge would be so precise about timing, exactly 3 days between observation and disaster, with no variation across 83 incidents. A few investigators, particularly those with religious inclinations or openness to paranormal explanations, suggested that Garrison had experienced genuine precognition, that he had been able to perceive future disasters 3 days before they occurred, and that what he recorded were not actual ships passing the lighthouse, but were visions of vessels that would soon sink. This theory would explain why no records existed for the ships he saw. They were visions rather than physical vessels, apparitions of doomed ships that appeared to Garrison 3 days before their destruction. But this theory required accepting that precognition was real, that time worked differently than conventional understanding assumed, and that Garrison had somehow been chosen, or cursed, to receive prophetic knowledge of maritime disasters. The Lighthouse Board's official conclusion, published in late 1890, was that Samuel Garrison had experienced progressive mental deterioration that caused him to make false logbook entries for ships that did not exist, and that the apparent correlation between his entries and subsequent maritime disasters was largely coincidental, with perhaps some element of Garrison using general knowledge of ship traffic patterns to make predictions that occasionally proved accurate. The board recommended that future lighthouse keepers be screened more carefully for psychological stability and that logbook entries should be subject to more rigorous verification procedures to prevent similar incidents of unreliable record-keeping. But this official conclusion satisfied almost no one who had examined the evidence carefully. The correlation between Garrison's entries and subsequent disasters was too consistent to be coincidental. The 3-day pattern was too precise. Garrison's descriptions of ships often matched details of the vessels that subsequently sank, despite those vessels having no official existence, and Garrison's final logbook entry predicting both a ship sinking and his own death on March 22, with both predictions proving accurate, seemed to exceed what delusion or coincidence could explain. The lighthouse keeper who replaced Garrison at Cape Perpetua, a man named Robert Morrison, was briefed about the phantom ship incident and was instructed to maintain careful logs and to report immediately if he experienced anything unusual. Morrison served at Cape Perpetua for 3 years from 1890 to 1893 without incident, recording ship passages that could all be verified in other records, experiencing no phantom ships or precognitive visions. This absence of unusual phenomena after Garrison's death suggested that whatever had been occurring was specific to Garrison rather than being connected to the lighthouse location itself, supporting theories that Garrison's experiences had been psychological rather than supernatural. But there was one disturbing detail in Morrison's tenure. On the anniversary of Garrison's death, March 26, 1891, exactly 1 year after Garrison's suicide, Morrison reported seeing a ship pass the lighthouse that he could not verify in any records. Morrison described it as a clipper ship sailing north, matching exactly Garrison's final phantom ship entry for the Destiny's End 1 year earlier. Morrison did not initially connect his observation to Garrison's logs, but when he reported the unverifiable ship to authorities and when they checked Garrison's records and found the matching description, Morrison became deeply disturbed and requested immediate transfer to another lighthouse, refusing to spend another night at Cape Perpetua. Morrison's report of seeing a phantom ship on the anniversary of Garrison's death and his panicked request for transfer generated new investigation into whether the phenomenon might be continuing or might be connected to the lighthouse location, rather than being unique to Garrison. But Morrison's replacement, who served at Cape Perpetua from 1893 through 1897, reported no unusual ship sightings or experiences, and subsequent keepers through the early 20th century similarly reported nothing unusual, maintaining standard logs that documented only verifiable vessels and that showed none of the anomalous entries that had characterized Garrison's final 2 years. The question of what Samuel Garrison actually experienced during those 2 years, from March 1888 through March 1890, has been debated by researchers, by paranormal investigators, and by maritime historians for over a century. The evidence that survives: Garrison's detailed logbooks, correspondence with the Lighthouse Board, testimony from inspectors who interviewed him, records of maritime disasters that correlated with his entries, is substantial and credible, making it difficult to simply dismiss the case as fraud or as obviously explicable through conventional means. One modern theory suggests that Garrison might have experienced a form of temporal lobe epilepsy that caused vivid and detailed hallucinations, specifically of ships, and that coincidentally, some of these hallucinated ships matched real vessels that subsequently sank. Temporal lobe epilepsy can cause extremely realistic visions that sufferers experience as indistinguishable from actual perception, and it can occur in patterns where visions repeat at regular intervals. This medical theory would explain Garrison's experiences as neurological rather than supernatural, but it struggles with the statistical improbability of hallucinations matching real disasters so consistently and with the precise 3-day timing pattern that characterized all 83 incidents. Another theory suggests that Garrison might have had access to information about ship movements and weather patterns that allowed him to predict which vessels were at risk of disaster, and that he recorded these predictions in his logbooks disguised as observations of ships passing the lighthouse. Perhaps Garrison received information from maritime networks about vessels departing various ports, combined this with his knowledge of coastal weather patterns and hazardous areas, and made educated guesses about which ships might encounter problems. This theory would explain his apparent precognitive knowledge as actually being probability calculation rather than prophecy. But it doesn't explain why he would disguise predictions as observations, why ships he recorded didn't exist in official records, or why he would continue making such predictions even after they were causing him severe psychological distress. The most unsettling theory is that Garrison experienced genuine precognition, that he could somehow perceive events 3 days before they occurred, and that the phantom ships he recorded were visions of vessels that existed in the future rather than in his present. This theory suggests that Garrison was looking 3 days forward in time when he observed ships passing the lighthouse, that he was seeing and recording vessels that would exist at that future moment, and that something about these particular ships, their destiny to sink, made them visible to his precognitive perception when other ships that would safely complete their voyages were not visible. This precognitive theory would explain several aspects of the phenomenon. It would explain why ships Garrison recorded didn't exist in present records, He was seeing them not as they were in his present, but as they would be 3 days later, at the moment of their destruction. It would explain the 3-day timing pattern. His precognitive window was consistently 3 days forward. It would explain why cameras or other observers couldn't verify the ships Garrison saw. Only he had access to the temporal displacement that allowed future perception, and it would explain Garrison's psychological deterioration, repeatedly experiencing visions of impending disasters that he could not prevent would be profoundly traumatic. But this precognitive theory requires accepting several things that conflict with conventional understanding of time and causation. It requires believing that time is not strictly linear, that future events can somehow be perceived before they occur, that human consciousness can access temporal information from beyond the present moment. Modern physics does suggest that time might not work exactly as common sense assumes. Relativity theory shows that time is relative and that simultaneity is not absolute. Quantum mechanics suggests that time might have properties that are counterintuitive, but none of established physics supports the idea that human beings can perceive future events through precognition. The psychological impact on Samuel Garrison, regardless of whether his experiences were hallucinations or genuine precognition, was clearly devastating. Garrison's personal notes in his logbooks document progressive despair, guilt about being unable to save lives, questioning of his own sanity, and ultimate conclusion that death was preferable to continuing to witness disasters he could not prevent. The burden of apparent prophetic knowledge, knowing disaster was coming but being powerless to stop it, created psychological torture that ended only with Garrison's suicide. This psychological dimension is perhaps the most important aspect of the case, regardless of what caused Garrison's experiences. Even if we cannot determine whether he was hallucinating or genuinely perceiving future events, we can recognize that experiencing apparent precognition of disasters is psychologically destructive. Knowledge of future tragedy without ability to prevent it creates helplessness and guilt that can destroy mental health. Garrison's case illustrates that some kinds of knowledge, even if they were possible to obtain, might be too burdensome for human psychology to handle. The sailors who died in the 83 maritime disasters that Garrison predicted remain largely anonymous because the ships they died on apparently had no existence in official records. The victims couldn't be identified as crew from specific vessels, their families often couldn't obtain confirmation of their deaths, and no official recognition of their losses occurred. They died in real sinkings, their bodies washed up on real shores, but in some sense they died on ghost ships that had no official existence, making them ghost sailors, whose deaths were recorded in Garrison's logs but not in maritime casualty lists. This erasure of the victims from official record is its own tragedy beyond the deaths themselves. Families who lost loved ones in these disasters often spent years or decades uncertain about what had happened, unable to obtain death certificates or insurance settlements, not knowing whether their missing relatives had died or had simply disappeared. The ghost ship phenomenon that Garrison documented created ghost victims whose deaths were real but whose official non-existence denied them recognition and denied their families closure. A few family members of missing sailors eventually connected their losses to Garrison's logs after the phantom ship phenomenon became publicized following his death. These families found descriptions in Garrison's records that matched information they had about their lost relatives' final voyages, found dates that matched when their relatives had departed on trips from which they never returned, found ship names that matched vessels their relatives had mentioned sailing on even though no official records existed for those ships. For these families, Garrison's logs became the only documentation of how and when their loved ones had died, the only memorial to victims who had been erased from official maritime records. The Cape Perpetua Lighthouse itself continued operating until 1957, when it was decommissioned and automated. The lighthouse keepers who served there after Garrison's death generally reported no unusual experiences beyond the one incident with Morrison seeing an apparent phantom ship on the first anniversary of Garrison's death. The lighthouse became a historic site, eventually being preserved and open to public tours, with Garrison's story becoming part of the location's dark history that tour guides would share with visitors interested in paranormal aspects of lighthouse keeping. Modern visitors to Cape Perpetua can climb to the top of the lighthouse and stand where Garrison stood when he made his observations, where he watched phantom ships pass, knowing they would sink 3 days later, and where he ultimately jumped to his death. The view from the lighthouse gallery is spectacular. Miles of rugged Oregon coastline, the vast Pacific Ocean extending to the horizon, rocky outcroppings where countless ships have wrecked over centuries of maritime activity. Standing there, it's easy to understand both the beauty and the isolation that lighthouse keepers experienced, and to imagine how observing this vast emptiness, day after day, might affect perception and sanity. Garrison's logbooks, which were preserved as evidence during the investigation into his death, and which were eventually donated to maritime museums, remain the primary physical evidence of the phantom ship phenomenon. The books are remarkable documents, detailed technical observations, recorded in careful handwriting, interspersed with increasingly desperate personal notes as Garrison's psychological condition deteriorated. The books document not just the phantom ships, but also Garrison's gradual realization that something impossible was occurring, his attempts to understand and cope with his experiences, and his ultimate surrender to despair when he concluded that his prophetic knowledge served no useful purpose. Researchers who have examined Garrison's logbooks note several interesting patterns. The phantom ship entries are consistently detailed and technically sophisticated, showing the same level of maritime knowledge and observational skill that characterize Garrison's normal entries for verifiable ships. The descriptions include specific details about ship types, rigging configurations, hull conditions, estimated tonnage and crew size, sailing speeds and directions, details that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly without genuine maritime expertise. This specificity suggests that Garrison was either genuinely perceiving something or was creating elaborate fictions based on deep knowledge of ship characteristics. The 3-day timing pattern is absolutely consistent across all 83 phantom ship entries. Every ship Garrison recorded sank exactly 3 days after his observation, with no exceptions or variations. This perfect consistency is statistically remarkable and is difficult to explain as coincidence. If Garrison was making random predictions, we would expect some variation, some ships sinking 2 days later or 4 days later, some predictions that didn't match any disaster at all. But the perfect 3-day pattern suggests either that Garrison was accessing some real information about future events, or that he was somehow involved in causing the disasters he predicted. But the theory that Garrison caused the disasters is extremely weak. How could a solitary lighthouse keeper cause 83 shipwrecks across 2 years? He had no access to ships once they passed his lighthouse, no means of sabotaging them or causing storms that would sink them, no network of accomplices who could execute his murderous plans. And even if he somehow had such capabilities, what possible motive would explain killing hundreds of sailors for no apparent gain while documenting his own crimes in official logbooks that he knew would be read by authorities? The more likely explanations remain either that Garrison experienced extended hallucinations that coincidentally matched real disasters, or that he genuinely experienced some form of precognition that allowed him to perceive ships 3 days before they sank. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. The hallucination theory struggles with the statistical improbability of so many matches, while the precognition theory requires accepting that prophetic knowledge is possible despite lack of scientific framework to explain how such knowledge could be obtained. The question of why phantom ships appeared to Garrison specifically, why he experienced this phenomenon rather than other lighthouse keepers or maritime observers, has been subject to speculation. Some have suggested that Garrison had latent psychic abilities that emerged under the isolation and stress of lighthouse keeping, that his years of watching the ocean and observing ships somehow opened his consciousness to perceiving beyond normal temporal boundaries. Others have suggested that Garrison might have experienced some neurological change, perhaps a brain injury, or the onset of epilepsy, or another condition that altered his perception in ways that made future events visible to him. There are historical precedents for individuals who claimed or appeared to have prophetic knowledge of specific disasters. Various alleged prophets and seers throughout history have claimed to predict earthquakes, shipwrecks, building collapses, and other catastrophes before they occurred. Most such claims have been debunked as fraud or as misremembered after-the-fact interpretations of vague predictions. But a few cases like Garrison's have sufficient documentation and specificity that they resist easy dismissal, creating genuine puzzles about whether precognition might sometimes occur, even if we cannot explain how. The philosophical implications of Garrison's case are profound, regardless of whether his experiences were real precognition or hallucination. If his experiences were real precognition, this suggests that time does not work as we normally assume, that future events somehow exist before they occur in ways that consciousness can access. This would challenge fundamental assumptions about causation, free will, and the nature of temporal reality. But even if Garrison's experiences were hallucinations, the case raises questions about the limits of consciousness and perception, about how isolated individuals can experience sustained complex delusions, and about how trauma and isolation affect human cognition and sanity. The impact of Garrison's case on lighthouse keeping practices was minimal. Authorities concluded that his experiences were unique to him rather than being a risk inherent to the profession. But the case did contribute to growing recognition in the late 19th century that isolated occupations like lighthouse keeping could create psychological stresses that affected workers' mental health and reliability. This recognition eventually led to reforms including shorter rotation periods for keepers, requirements for regular inspections and psychological assessments, and better support systems for keepers experiencing difficulties. The maritime disasters that Garrison predicted, which killed hundreds of sailors across 2 years, occurred during a period when ship safety was improving, but when maritime travel remained dangerous. The 1880s saw implementation of new safety regulations, better ship construction standards, improved navigation equipment, and more rigorous training for officers and crew. But storms remained unpredictable, navigation in coastal waters remained treacherous, and ship construction and maintenance standards varied widely. The disaster rate was declining, but remained high enough that Garrison's prediction of 83 sinkings over 2 years, while statistically unusual, was not impossible given the hazards of maritime commerce in that era. Some researchers have suggested that Garrison's apparent precognitive knowledge might have been less mystical than it appeared, that his years of experience observing ships and weather might have given him unconscious ability to assess which vessels appeared poorly maintained or unseaworthy, which courses seemed risky given weather patterns, which captains seemed to be taking unnecessary risks. Perhaps what appeared to be precognition was actually expert pattern recognition, Garrison's brain processing subtle cues about ship quality and voyage safety that he couldn't articulate consciously but that manifested as detailed visions of phantom ships that his mind knew were doomed. This expert intuition theory has some appeal. It would explain Garrison's accuracy without requiring supernatural precognition, and it would be consistent with research showing that experts in various fields can make accurate predictions based on pattern recognition that operates below conscious awareness. But this theory struggles to explain several key aspects of Garrison's case. It doesn't explain why ships he recorded had no existence in official registries. Expert intuition might allow prediction of which real ships would sink, but it wouldn't create false ship identities that Garrison would record. It doesn't explain the perfect 3-day timing pattern. Expert intuition might give general sense of vessels at risk, but it wouldn't produce consistent, precise temporal predictions. And it doesn't explain why Garrison's expert intuition would suddenly emerge in March 1888 after years of normal observation and recording, suggesting a sudden change rather than gradual development of expertise. The families of sailors who died in the disasters Garrison predicted faced unique grief complicated by the phantom ship phenomenon. Many families never received confirmation of how their loved ones died, never obtained death certificates or official recognition of their losses, because the ships their relatives died on apparently didn't exist in official records. These families were left in limbo, knowing their loved ones were dead based on bodies that washed ashore or on wreckage that was found, but unable to obtain official documentation or closure because the vessels involved couldn't be identified or verified. Some families found small comfort in Garrison's logbooks, which provided the only documentation of their relatives' final voyages. Reading Garrison's descriptions of phantom ships that matched what families knew about their loved ones' planned routes and vessels gave them some confirmation of what had happened, even if official maritime authorities wouldn't recognize the evidence. But this comfort was mixed with horror at realizing that someone had recorded their relatives' doomed voyages 3 days before the disasters occurred, that Garrison had watched ships pass, knowing everyone aboard would soon be dead, that prophetic knowledge had existed but had been powerless to save anyone. The 3-day window between Garrison's observations and the subsequent disasters has been analyzed extensively for what it might reveal about the nature of time and causation. Why 3 days specifically? Was this the limit of Garrison's precognitive ability? Could he see only 3 days forward and no further? Or was 3 days somehow significant for other reasons? Perhaps the average time it took for ships to travel from Cape Perpetua to locations where disasters occurred, suggesting Garrison was perceiving ships at their moments of destruction, and then projecting those perceptions backward 3 days. Some researchers have noted that 3 days appears in various religious and mythological contexts. Christ's resurrection after 3 days in the tomb, Jonah's 3 days in the whale's belly, various 3-day journeys, or trials in folklore and legend. Perhaps 3 days has psychological or archetypal significance that influenced how Garrison's brain constructed or organized his precognitive experiences. But this symbolic interpretation doesn't explain why the 3-day pattern would be so precisely consistent across 83 separate incidents, unless Garrison's unconscious mind was imposing rigid structure on chaotic precognitive information to make it psychologically manageable. The question of whether Garrison could have prevented any of the disasters if he had been believed, and if authorities had been able to identify and intercept the ships he reported, remains a tragic counterfactual. Garrison tried desperately to warn authorities, sending telegrams and letters describing ships he had seen that he knew would sink, but because the ships couldn't be verified or located, no interventions were possible. If authorities had taken Garrison's warnings seriously despite being unable to verify the ships, if they had issued general storm warnings, or had increased coastal patrols during periods when Garrison reported phantom ships, might some lives have been saved. But even if authorities had wanted to act on Garrison's warnings, the practical difficulties would have been immense. How do you warn a ship that apparently doesn't exist? How do you intercept a vessel that has no registry and that no maritime authority knows about? Garrison's warnings were useless, not because officials dismissed them, but because they provided no actionable information. Ship names that weren't registered, descriptions that didn't match any known vessels, courses that couldn't be traced to any departed ships. The phantom nature of the ships made prevention impossible, even if the predictions were genuine. The psychological torture of possessing prophetic knowledge that couldn't be used to save lives is perhaps the most horrible aspect of Garrison's experience. He watched 83 ships pass his lighthouse, knowing that in 3 days the people aboard would die. He tried desperately to warn them, to save them, to use his impossible knowledge for good, but the knowledge was useless, worse than useless, because it burdened him with awareness of impending tragedy without giving him any power to prevent it. This combination of knowledge and helplessness destroyed Garrison psychologically, making him unable to continue living with the weight of all those predicted deaths. Modern psychological understanding of trauma and helplessness provides framework for understanding Garrison's deterioration. Research on moral injury, psychological damage that occurs when people witness or participate in events that violate their moral beliefs and feel unable to prevent or make right, suggests that Garrison experienced profound moral injury from being forced to witness disaster after disaster without being able to save anyone. The moral injury from watching 83 ships full of doomed sailors pass by over 2 years, knowing their fates but being powerless to help, would create guilt, despair, and psychological anguish that could indeed lead to suicide as the only escape. The single incident of Garrison's replacement, seeing a phantom ship on the anniversary of Garrison's death, has never been adequately explained. Robert Morrison, who had been warned about Garrison's experiences, but who had served without incident for a year, reported seeing a ship exactly matching Garrison's final phantom ship entry 1 year to the day after Garrison's suicide. Morrison's report was credible. He was a trained maritime observer with no history of psychological problems, and he had no apparent motive to fabricate such a report. But the incident terrified Morrison enough that he requested immediate transfer and refused to spend another night at Cape Perpetua, suggesting he experienced something genuinely disturbing rather than simply making up a story. One interpretation is that Morrison, knowing about Garrison's experiences and knowing the anniversary date, experienced a form of suggestion or expectation that manifested as a hallucinated ship matching what he knew Garrison had reported. The power of suggestion and expectation in creating perceptual experiences is well documented. People who expect to see things sometimes do see them, their brains constructing experiences that match expectations. But Morrison had been at the lighthouse for a full year without experiencing anything unusual, suggesting he was not particularly suggestible or prone to seeing things that weren't there. The fact that his phantom ship appeared specifically on the anniversary and matched Garrison's description exactly is a disturbing coincidence at minimum. Another interpretation is that whatever phenomenon Garrison experienced, whether precognition or hallucination or something else, somehow left an imprint on the location or on the circumstances that could be triggered by specific conditions. Perhaps the anniversary date created psychological or even physical conditions that temporarily allowed Morrison to perceive what Garrison had perceived, giving him a brief glimpse into whatever reality or unreality Garrison had been experiencing for 2 years. This interpretation ventures into paranormal territory that most scientists would reject, but it has the advantage of explaining why Morrison's single phantom ship experience occurred at exactly the time and place that would make sense if something unusual about Cape Perpetua or about anniversary dates had relevance. The Cape Perpetua Lighthouse remained operational for decades after Garrison's death and Morrison's transfer, with numerous keepers serving without reporting unusual experiences. This suggests that whatever occurred during Garrison's tenure and Morrison's brief anniversary experience was not consistently reproducible, that it required specific conditions or specific individuals to manifest. Modern ghost hunters and paranormal investigators who have visited the lighthouse have reported various allegedly unusual experiences, feeling presences, experiencing cold spots, hearing unexplained sounds, but these reports are typical of paranormal tourism and don't provide credible evidence of ongoing phenomena related to Garrison's phantom ships. The lighthouse today operates automatically with periodic maintenance visits, but no resident keeper, as modern navigation technology has reduced reliance on traditional lighthouses. The building is preserved as a historic structure and is open for tours during summer months, with Garrison's story being a highlight of the historical narrative that guides share with visitors. Some visitors report feeling unsettled or experiencing unease when they hear about Garrison's experiences and his suicide, finding it disturbing to stand in the location where someone documented impossible disasters before jumping to his death. The logbooks Garrison kept are housed in the Oregon Maritime Museum in Portland, where researchers can request access to examine them. The books are fragile now, more than 130 years old, and are handled carefully to prevent further deterioration, but they remain legible and available for study, providing primary source evidence of Garrison's experiences and of his psychological deterioration as he struggled to understand and cope with what he was perceiving. The books are remarkable documents of one person's encounter with something, whether psychological or supernatural, that exceeded his ability to comprehend or to bear. The statistical analysis of Garrison's phantom ship entries and corresponding disasters has been conducted multiple times over the decades since his death, with increasingly sophisticated statistical methods being applied as such methods have been developed. The most recent analysis, conducted in 2010 using modern statistical software and Bayesian probability frameworks, concluded that the probability of the correlation between Garrison's 83 phantom ship entries and 83 maritime disasters occurring by chance, given the precise 3-day timing pattern and the 2-year time frame, was less than 1 in several million. This makes coincidence an extremely unlikely explanation, though the analysis could not determine what non-coincidental mechanism might account for the correlation. The question of whether any of Garrison's phantom ship entries might have been deliberate frauds, entries he made after learning about disasters rather than before they occurred, has been investigated thoroughly, but the logbooks show no evidence of backdating or of entries being inserted after the fact. The entries are in chronological order with no gaps or inconsistencies that would suggest manipulation. Monthly reports Garrison submitted to the Lighthouse Board included the phantom ship entries and were dated and postmarked before the corresponding disasters occurred, providing verification that Garrison was documenting his observations in real time rather than creating false records after the fact. The maritime insurance industry took interest in Garrison's case after his death, wondering whether prophetic knowledge of ship disasters could ever be reliable enough to affect insurance underwriting and risk assessment. If lighthouse keepers or other maritime observers could reliably predict which ships would sink, even if they couldn't explain how they knew, this would be valuable information for insurers trying to assess risk. But investigation showed that Garrison's case was unique, that no other maritime observers reported similar precognitive experiences, and that attempts to train observers to perceive doomed ships failed to produce any reliable predictions. The insurance industry concluded that Garrison's experiences, whatever their nature, were not replicable or usable for practical commercial purposes. The broader question of whether precognition is possible and whether some people might have genuine access to future information remains controversial and unsettled. Parapsychology researchers have conducted thousands of experiments attempting to demonstrate precognition under controlled conditions with mixed and disputed results. Some experiments have produced statistical results that seem to show precognitive abilities beyond what chance would predict, but these results have not been consistently reproducible and are rejected by most mainstream scientists as likely resulting from methodological flaws or statistical artifacts rather than from genuine precognition. The Garrison case is sometimes cited by parapsychology researchers as evidence that precognition can occur in real-world contexts even if it's difficult to demonstrate in laboratory settings. The detailed documentation, the specificity of predictions, the perfect timing pattern, and Garrison's obvious psychological distress all suggest genuine experiences rather than fraud or simple delusion. But skeptics point out that even well-documented anomalous cases don't prove that supernatural explanations are correct, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the Garrison case, however well-documented, still has possible natural explanations even if those explanations are imperfect. The philosophical problem of precognition, how knowledge of future events could exist and how it could be obtained, has troubled philosophers since ancient times. If the future is genuinely open and undetermined, as common sense suggests and as some interpretations of quantum mechanics might support, then precognition would be impossible because there would be nothing to know about the future until it becomes present. But if the future is determined and already exists in some sense, as other physical theories suggest, then perhaps consciousness could in principle access information about future events through mechanisms we don't yet understand. Garrison's case doesn't resolve these philosophical debates, but it provides a concrete example that philosophers reference when discussing whether precognition could be coherent and possible. The impact of Garrison's suicide on the small community of lighthouse keepers along the Oregon and California coasts was significant. Lighthouse keeping was already recognized as a psychologically demanding job due to isolation, harsh conditions, and the heavy responsibility of maintaining lights that sailors' lives depended on. Garrison's case highlighted that the job could be even more psychologically dangerous than generally recognized, that the combination of isolation, monotony, and constant ocean observation could affect mental health in serious ways. Some keepers requested transfers to less isolated stations after learning about Garrison's experiences and death, preferring more social environments where psychological difficulties might be more easily noticed and addressed. The United States Lighthouse Service, which oversaw federal lighthouses, issued guidelines after Garrison's death about monitoring keepers' psychological well-being and about recognizing warning signs of mental health deterioration. Inspectors were instructed to pay attention to keepers' logbook entries for signs of unusual observations or increasingly personal or irrational notes that might indicate developing psychological problems. The service also reduced the length of continuous assignments at the most isolated lighthouses, recognizing that extended isolation without breaks could contribute to mental health problems. These reforms likely prevented some future tragedies by identifying struggling keepers and providing support or reassignment before problems became severe. But they also couldn't completely eliminate the psychological risks inherent in lighthouse keeping, particularly at isolated stations where keepers spent months or years with minimal human contact beyond periodic supply deliveries. Lighthouse keeping remained a difficult job that attracted certain personality types, people comfortable with solitude, self-sufficient individuals who didn't require constant social interaction, those who found satisfaction in routine maintenance and in the knowledge that their work saved lives even if they rarely saw direct results. The question of whether Garrison would have survived and recovered if he had received different support or if he had left his position earlier remains a painful counterfactual. Garrison requested relief from his duties in January 1890, explicitly stating that he could no longer bear the psychological burden of his position. If his request had been granted immediately, if he had been transferred to a less isolated position or had been given leave to recover, might he have survived? The Lighthouse Board's decision to deny his request, based on lack of immediate replacement and on belief that leaving his structured duties might worsen his condition, proved tragically wrong. Garrison's suicide 2 months after his denied request suggests he had reached a point where he could no longer continue, where the psychological burden had become unbearable. Modern understanding of suicide and of psychological crisis intervention suggests that Garrison showed clear warning signs that should have triggered immediate action, explicit statements about being unable to continue, documented psychological deterioration in his logbooks, isolation combined with exposure to repeated trauma, witnessing 83 predicted disasters. Contemporary crisis intervention protocols would have required immediate evaluation and likely would have resulted in Garrison being removed from his position and receiving psychological treatment. But in 1890, such protocols didn't exist, and psychological distress was often not taken seriously until it reached catastrophic levels. The location where Garrison died, the rocks 150 feet below the lighthouse where he jumped, became a site that subsequent lighthouse keepers found disturbing and avoided when possible. Maintenance work that required approaching that area of rocks created anxiety and unease in workers who knew what had happened there. Some keepers reported feeling uncomfortable at the lighthouse gallery where Garrison had stood before jumping, feeling that the location carried some residual presence or memory of his final moments. These reactions were likely psychological. The power of knowing terrible events occurred in specific locations to make those locations feel haunted or disturbing, even when nothing supernatural is occurring. The 83 phantom ships that Samuel Garrison recorded between March 1888 and March 1890 represent one of history's most documented and most disturbing cases of alleged precognition. Whether Garrison experienced genuine prophetic visions of doomed vessels, or whether he experienced extended hallucinatory episodes that coincidentally correlated with real maritime disasters, remains uncertain more than 130 years after his death. The evidence supporting genuine precognition is strong. The detailed documentation, the consistent 3-day timing, the perfect correlation between predictions and disasters. But the evidence is not conclusive, and natural explanations remain possible, even if imperfect. What is certain is that Samuel Garrison suffered profoundly from his experiences, that he was tortured by apparent knowledge of disasters he couldn't prevent, and that this torture ultimately drove him to suicide. Whether his knowledge was genuine precognition or was elaborate delusion doesn't change the fact that he experienced it as real, that he lived for 2 years watching ships he believed were doomed sail past his lighthouse, that he tried desperately to save lives and failed, and that the accumulation of helplessness and guilt destroyed his will to live. The sailors who died in the 83 disasters Garrison predicted were real people whose lives were cut short by the hazards of maritime commerce in the late 19th century. They died in storms, in collisions, in groundings on rocky coasts, in the various disasters that claimed thousands of lives each year during that era of sailing. That a lighthouse keeper recorded their doomed voyages 3 days before they died, whether through precognition or through coincidence, doesn't change the reality of their deaths or diminish the grief of families they left behind. The Cape Perpetua Lighthouse stands today as it stood in Garrison's time, still warning ships away from dangerous rocks, still serving as a beacon for vessels navigating the treacherous Oregon coast. But the lighthouse also stands as a memorial to Samuel Garrison and to the unsolved mystery of the phantom ships he recorded, as a reminder that reality sometimes contains experiences that exceed our ability to explain, and as a testament to the psychological toll that isolated observation of the ocean's dangers can take on those who watch and wait and record what really happened at Cape Perpetua between 1888 and 1890. Did Samuel Garrison possess genuine precognitive ability that allowed him to see doomed ships 3 days before they sank? Or did he experience extended psychological breakdown that created elaborate hallucinations that coincidentally matched real disasters? Or was something else occurring that we still lack the framework to understand? These questions remain unanswered. But what we know for certain is that Samuel Garrison's experience, documented carefully in logbooks that survive to this day, represents something profound and disturbing about consciousness, perception, and the burden of knowledge that cannot be used to save lives. Whether his phantom ships were visions of the future or products of a mind breaking under isolation and stress, they destroyed him, driving him ultimately to the rocks below his lighthouse where his watch ended. What do you think happened at Cape Perpetua? Did Garrison have genuine precognition? Was it extended hallucination? Could expert intuition explain his predictions? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried. It's just waiting in the shadows.